Hi everyone. I wanted to take an opportunity to talk specifically about the two studies that you learned more about in the last two videos, the Stanford Prison Study and the Obedience Study by Stanley Milgram. Both of those videos did a great job about discussing the details, the context, and the findings of the study, but I want to offer some new perspectives and put them together for those two studies and how we can think a little bit differently about conformity and obedience and what that means for the world around us and for our own behavior. So you watched a video on the Stanford Prison Study. Again, this video went into good details about what the study entailed. I wanted to share with you that in 2015, the Stanford Prison Study was made into a film. Dr. Phil Zimbardo has said that every detail in that film is accurate, that there were some things that happened in the study that were not included in the film, but that everything in that film is portrayed accurately as to how it really happened. Now, I have to tell you that I've learned about the Stanford Prison Study for many, many years and many different ways. I've read the transcript. And yet it took me multiple sittings to watch through this film. So it is available on Netflix. I encourage you, if you're interested, to check it out, but it is very disturbing and quite haunting, even taking into consideration some of the newest details about the study. It's a hard thing to watch. So I just wanted to offer that word of caution to you. So as you saw at the end of the video on the Stanford Prison Study, there is some controversy over this demonstration. Now, it has been named one of the most famous or infamous studies in psychology. It is included in almost every intro to psych text. It was not included in yours. I think one of the reasons why that is because of some of the recent controversies. People are starting to question its value and importance in the field. But I think because of its history of importance in the discipline, I wanted to be sure you were aware of it, but not without kind of equally acknowledging the controversy. So as was discussed in the video that you watched, and I want to continue it here, that some of the more recent details that have been divulged are that perhaps Dr. Zimbardo wasn't telling the story quite how it happened, that some of the data may have been hidden or falsified or somehow manipulated, and that really what seems to be the case is that these young college students didn't act without being offered suggestions and sometimes specific instructions for how they were to behave. For instance, you can see at the top of the screen, there's an op-ed. This was in the Stanford newspaper, written by Carlo Prescott. Carlo Prescott was a consultant working for the Stanford Prison Study. He had been formerly incarcerated at San Quentin Prison, and his job was to consult with the research team to try and make the circumstances as lifelike, as real as possible. And so he took his experience at San Quentin and translated that into the methods of the Stanford Prison Study. And in this op-ed, if you can read it and see more closely, he basically says, in essence, that these were not the acts and behaviors of Stanford college students, but that this was the specific instruction and encouragement of the research staff. And so he's giving more information there, and much more information, as you see, has come out more recently. Now, the video that you watched ended on kind of, a question of, what do you think? And I'll tell you that for me, I certainly think that there is controversy around how the quote-unquote study was originally reported. Zimbardo himself calls it now a demonstration, more of a study, and I think that that is an accurate term. My thoughts are that regardless of whether the students were given specific instructions or not, they engaged in behavior that was harmful. These were quote-unquote good people that engaged in troubling and hurtful behavior toward others. And so I think that that's important to take away. And this study doesn't exist in a silo. This happens in the real world as well. You may have likely seen examples of this in your life, and there are certainly some very disturbing and traumatic and severe cases that we've seen in life around us. So in 2004, some pictures and videos were leaked, and the press reported that there was incidences of physical, psychological, and sexual abuse taking place by U.S. military officials and other government agencies at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. This was a detention center in Iraq that held prisoners, and there were extreme reports of prisoner abuse and even homicide. Now, Philip Zimbardo actually went on trial as an expert witness for one of the military officials that was being charged for prisoner maltreatment, saying that yes, these individuals have to be held accountable for, but again, it's important to take into consideration the social environment, the situation in the system of prison, of military, and that these aren't just a couple of bad apples, was his argument, but that this is potentially a bad tree or a bad barrel. This will sound familiar, that Sergeant Frederick was one of those military officials that was tried for maltreatment. He pled not guilty, and this is what he said. "We had no support, no training whatsoever. I kept asking my chain of command for certain things like rules and regulations, and it just wasn't happening. We had to use force sometimes to get the inmates to cooperate, just like our rules of engagement said. They just didn't want to listen. So sometimes you would just have to give them a little nudge or something like that to get them to cooperate so we could get the mission accomplished." So hopefully that sounds somewhat familiar of what Adolf Eichmann was saying on his own trial for war crimes during the Holocaust. So that is a good segue to lead us to Stanley Milgram's study on obedience. Do people do terrible things because they're simply obeying orders? We need to think about the social context in describing or explaining behavior and why people do the things that they do. So again, you watched a video on the Stanley Milgram study about the details and the findings. I want to provide a bit of a different perspective than the one that you heard about on the video, which touted this as being a demonstration of obedience. That's certainly true, but I think we can also look about obedience in terms of conformity. So I'll talk more about that in just a moment. I forgot about this slide. Just like the Stanford prison study, this too was made happens in real life around us. People will obey orders and do things that they would never think that they would do and certainly wouldn't do under typical circumstances. You see here an image of a real life example, and then this too was made into a Hollywood film called Compliance. What you see here pictured is Louise Ogburn, who was an employee at McDonald's. She's on the phone talking to a supposed police officer. The context here is that there's been a series of prank calls at fast food restaurants around the United States with a caller posing as a police officer, in this case saying that there had been a theft at the restaurant and he needed the help of the assistant manager, and what you see here is the assistant manager's fiance, to get to the bottom of the crime. In this case, Louise Ogburn was called out as the potential thief, and she was, by way of orders on the phone from the officer, stripped down naked. You see her here talking to the supposed officer in just an apron. Both the victim here, Louise Ogburn, as well as the assistant manager and fiance, forced her to perform a series of lewd acts and behaviors. And so this is an example, again, of people doing things that they would say they would never do, doing terrible things to hurt someone else. Just so you know the kind of ending of this story, Louise Ogburn and the manager herself sued McDonald's. Apparently they had been aware of these prank calls. It happened at, as I said, over 70 different restaurants, McDonald's and others in the United States. They did end up finding the prank caller, but both Louise Ogburn and the assistant manager settled with McDonald's out of court for a substantial sum of money. So what's going on here? Are people really just following orders with an authority figure? That's how these studies have been, that's how the results have been talked about for long periods of times. But really, when you look at the Stanley Milgram study data, the results, you see something very different. If you remember from the video, the researcher gave the teacher a series of prompts to encourage them to continue the study when they would express some concern. At first, the researcher would say, please continue or please go on. What you see here on the slide is then with that kind of encouragement, 64% of people went to the final step, right? The last switch on the electrical box. Then you can see that the encouragements kind of continue in their strength. The last resort was to issue an order. The researcher would say to the teacher, "Teacher, you have no other choice. You must continue." This was the first and only order. And look at what happens at the compliance rate when a very direct order is given. It goes to 0%, meaning every single person, when receiving that order, stops. Why? Well, we think particularly for an individualistic culture like the United States, where the study was conducted, independence, autonomy is strongly valued. And so the minute you give a direct order, you take that away from someone, and they respond by saying, "No, I absolutely have a choice. You can't make me do this." And so they stop. So the order, obedience, seems to actually be less powerful than conformity. So this perspective on the data would suggest that the findings are related to conformity, not obedience. And in fact, the same has been argued for Adolf Eichmann, that he wasn't just following orders, that military official at Abu Ghraib wasn't just following orders. In fact, what they were doing is they had become part of a group where, as the military official said, the mission must be accomplished. For the Holocaust, for the Nazi Party, the mission must be accomplished. And even for the Milgram study, the mission of science, of completing the study for the benefit of science, must be accomplished. And all parties believed in that so strongly that they created a group, and that all behavior had to conform to that mission, despite the significant cost and harm to others. So people say evil is hard work. We don't do it just because we're kind of blindly following orders. That it's done because people see it as a labor of love. People see it as something that must be done for the mission, for a moral principle, right? To keep behavior in accordance with some standard that's so important. Now, we don't conform equally all the time, so I think this is really important to include. It's talked about briefly in your reading, but this is data from Stanley Milgram study. He did that obedience study under all kinds of different settings to try and tease apart really what makes a group conform and then obey with these absurd requests of continuing despite harming another. I'm not going to go into details here about every specific study that was done. You can pause and take a look at this image, but what I will do is summarize it. That, in Milgram's first study, 63 to 65% of people complied to the last switch. But by manipulating or changing factors of the setting, he was able to have 0 compliance rates all the way up to 93 compliance rates. The factors that seem to matter the most are these: the location of the person giving orders, and in part their perceived authority. So when Stanley Milgram moved the researcher away into another space onto the phone, you saw compliance go down. Yet you can still see an example with the obedience case in McDonald's that, all of these people were just talking to a prank caller and yet complied with their, again, absurd requests. If there's any kind of role model for defiance or role model for compliance, then you can see compliance or obedience go, again, down or up, depending on what the rest of the group is doing. And it doesn't take much. Even if there's just one other person who's defying the order, you're more likely to see the group defy the order. And then the last is if the victim is depersonalized. If they're depersonalized by just putting them in another room, by putting them in another building, by dehumanizing them in some way because of maybe they're part of a group that has a strong negative stereotype against them, then you're more likely to see people comply with the last and shock them all the way up to the end. I want you to think about these things and look at the world around you. See where you look to see where you see people hurting others, where you see people defying conformity, being nonconformists in order for, let's say, so that standing up for others so that they're not harmed, they're not oppressed or marginalized. Think about this in the world around you. Put on your social psychological lens. And I encourage you to think about how might certain people groups be being dehumanized so that they can be further marginalized or oppressed or abused. Where and how are people looking to certain figures of authority and following their suggestions? What kinds of role models might there be in the world around us for defiance or compliance, and what does that look like? Again, you might choose one of these options to further develop in your assignment for this week, but if not, I hope that you just pause and really wrestle with this as you apply it to the world around you. To end, this has been a difficult topic, a difficult discussion. But I think it's important that Stanley Milgram himself said that people are sheep, they're not wolves. It's not about evil people, although that may be the case, that there are bad people doing bad things in the world, but more likely than so, it's really good-natured people who want the best for themselves and others, and yet they're sheep because the power of conformity is strong. It is a strong pressure, and so I think it's important to know this, so that you can be thoughtful about your beliefs and your behaviors as you engage in the world around you. But it's also important to keep that intention with the fact that these factors or these pressures of conformity, while they can be used to do hurtful things, they can also be used to foster virtue. So Dr. Phil Zimbardo himself he used to be called Dr. Evil, and he has actually kind of changed his perception and is now working toward using those same situational factors of the environment and investigating how we can do virtuous things, how we can actually be heroic. He would argue that heroism is not just for the superheroes of Marvel or DC Comics, but really that any average person can be a hero if they are aware of and can take advantage of certain social opportunities and ignore the things that might make us ignore the calls for help from others. So one of your readings for this week will also be about helping others and pro-social behavior. So I hope you can, again, not be too discouraged by the ways in which we can engage in antisocial behavior, but be aware so that you can make a difference and engage in more pro-social behavior with each other. Let's make the world a better place. Thank you, everybody. Happy learning.